Hello and welcome to Capital Insight. I'm State Representative Kevin Mannix from Salem, and I'm your host for this program, which is designed to give all of us a little more insight about what goes on in our capital and some of the individuals and issues which are all around us in the capital city. Today we have a guest who's going to help us understand a little bit more about the issue of runaways, teenage runaways, and what we might do about it, and it's Betty Uchytil.
Hi, Kevin.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
One of the things we try to do at the beginning of each of these shows is to get some idea of people who are in government and what their background is like. Can you tell us what your official position is right now?
Well, my official position is I'm the Assistant Administrator for Program Operations in the State Office for Services to Children and Families.
Now, tell us what that official title really means.
Well, I supervise the program managers who have programs like Child Protective Services, foster care, the residential treatment alternatives, adoptions, that kind of thing. And they write the rules and policies, and they develop new programs, and they do program reviews and quality assurance on our programs.
Now, before you got into this, we're going to take you back a little bit. Can you tell us a little bit about where you're from and what your schooling was about?
Sure. I was born and raised in Eugene, and I went to Eugene schools, and I graduated from the University of Oregon. I started working for what was then public welfare 2 months after I graduated in August of 1969.
What was your degree?
Political science. And I've been with the agency ever since. We were public welfare, and then for a long time we were Children's Services Division, and now we're the State Office for Services to Children and Families.
Now, do you think it's any great advantage to have seen the name of the agency get so big?
No, I do not. It's a name that doesn't roll off the tongue comfortably for people. On the other hand, we didn't feel really good about changing from PWD, which was Public Welfare Division, into the Children's Services Division. We felt like we'd left part of ourselves behind. That was a long time ago. So I suppose we'll get used to this change too.
How about Kids Are Us or some such?
Well, Children's Services Division did have a nice ring about it that we all kind of could relate to. But like I say, I think we'll get used to this. It's been kind of a massive effort to change, and it's not one we would like to go through really soon again.
And you're talking about everything from the paperwork to the cards that people hand out to the names on the buildings and all that stuff? Or are you talking about structural change in the agency itself?
Well, no, just the technical changes, because we are a legal entity, and we are also the legal guardian and sometimes the legal parent of the children in our care. And so every court order had to change, every legal document had to change, and it's been a massive undertaking.
Did anybody tell the fancy pants legislators who were pushing for this name change, and you don't have to agree with my characterization, about all the bureaucratic ramifications of changing something in the statute?
This change came about in House Bill 2004, which I think had 57 or 59 revisions, and the name change was a very minor piece of that massive piece of legislation.
So people really didn't talk about the impact of that?
They did not.
Now, realistically, once you're through that impact, we're back to the heavy-duty issues, which is what are we going to do to serve our kids? But I'm still curious a little bit about you as a person, because here you are, one of the HIMA jobs in this process. You've talked about being in public service for 26 years. Have you found that frustrating or meaningful? How does it feel to be in this position?
Most of the time, well, I have had frustrations, but I feel like it's been a real meaningful career. I felt like all the things I've had to do from the years I was a caseworker to a supervisor to a program staff person and a manager and now an assistant administrator, everything that I've had to do I felt were important things to be done. And I feel like the job that our agency does is one of the most important things government can do, which is protect and take care of vulnerable children. And it's something that nobody else can do if their parents aren't doing it for them. So I have felt like it's been a real honor to be able to do this work, and most of the time I've enjoyed it, and I found it very challenging. There have been frustrations about it.
In your almost 26 years now of service, going back to 1969, you mentioned 2 months after graduation.
Mm-hmm.
What would you see as the major shift in what we've been doing in terms of services to kids and trying to work with families? Maybe there's not just one you could mention, but can you tell us about some of the dynamics of change in those 26 years?
Well, there have been changes in the statutes. We've learned things, and the population that we're serving has changed. And I'll start with the latter. When I started as a caseworker, we served anybody who had a public assistance case, who either wanted services or somebody thought this family needed services, and that was all the way from very serious child abuse cases to people who were feeding their surplus foods to their chickens. And so we were involved in the whole gamut of those kinds of cases. Now the only cases that we serve are cases that are very severe. They're cases where there must be an intervention, either because abuse and neglect is happening or the child needs treatment or a service, or there will be serious consequences. So the cases are very severe.
Now, the less severe cases are handled at the county level by the Children and Family Commissions and associated social service agencies, or how are they handled?
Well, I think in some cases that's true. In other cases, the jobs program that we've seen kind of picking up steam in Oregon has actually picked up some of those services that nobody offered for years and years and years to families who are receiving public assistance and need some extra help.
So as a connection to welfare reform, as we put it, jobs and jobs plus, we're now seeing a side benefit that I hadn't heard talked about before, which is some kids in need are also getting some additional services.
That's true, because their parents are helped to find daycare. If there are barriers to parents getting employment that involve helping the family, the Jobs Plus program can provide assistance in strengthening those families, and those are families that are not abusing or neglecting their children. They're just having problems providing for the overall well-being of their family, and that includes getting a job.
Had anybody talked about that as a side benefit? Because I didn't remember it coming up, and now that you mention it, it seems to me that, gee, that's a real positive component, and it would have been a great selling point for those of us who are very strong supporters of those programs, but you know, we had to argue against some opposition. But had that been something that came up and maybe I just ignored it at the time?
I don't think it came up. I think people were really focused when they discussed starting the program on the outcome of getting people jobs and getting people off the rolls, which is a good outcome, and in and of itself it helps people not to be dependent on public assistance. But I don't think the side benefit of helping families to care better for their family members was discussed.
It's a little ironic to me because some of the opponents of Jobs Plus were some of the more liberal legislators who actually, if we thought about this other side element, we might have said, hey, you know, this is a really progressive thing too. It's not just putting people to work, but it's also helping deal with a family with kids at risk or whatever else. Well, aside from that, in terms of the changes and dynamics, has there been a trend in the last few years that you've particularly noticed that you would want to highlight? Anything that comes to mind?
I think that we are doing a much better job of identifying and treating some issues that we didn't even know about 20 years ago, particularly sexual abuse, certain kinds of drug abuse and how it's involved with families. I think we're doing a lot better job than we were then. We didn't even recognize the dynamics of much of the sexual abuse, nor of much of the alcohol and drug abuse and what it was doing with our families 20 years ago.
Now let's shift to a more specific issue, and we can talk about issues that relate to it, and that's child runaways, usually teenage runaways. And the law in Oregon, there's been some news attention lately to the tragic shooting of 3 teenagers in the Springfield area, from the Springfield area. One boy was 15, and girl was 15, and a boy was 13. And so far, although we'll leave aside the legal process as to who did it and whatever the motives may have been, the information we have is that these 3 teenagers were at least on the margin of being runaways. Sometimes they were in contact with their family, but often they were not, and that the parents had been seeking assistance in trying to control and detain the kids, and found that the police were not able to detain them simply because they were runaways, that there was a tougher standard that would have to be imposed as to having committed a crime or being in immediate danger before there could be any intervention. As I understand it, there was a change in the law about in the mid-'80s where police were no longer authorized to detain runaways simply because they were runaways. Were you involved in the political process at the time that happened? And if so, can you help explain it?
Sure. I was peripherally involved in the political process, but very much involved in the process of trying to decide what we were going to do when the law passed. I think you're speaking of House Bill 2936, which passed in the 1983 session, which was the last time that Oregon was able to hold runaways in detention.
Correct.
And at that time, it was, I think it was a surprise to many of us in our agency. It seemed to us like a last-minute decision in the session to put some things together and to put this law together. So there wasn't a lot of preliminary planning about what we were going to do when the law changed, because we didn't know the law was going to change. So
it's one of those surprise, and politicians have just done something to you.
Well, and it was I think what's referred to as an omnibus bill, where a lot of things got put together at the last minute. And so we had that period of time from the end of the session to sometime in October to decide how we were going to handle this. And frankly, there were not any new resources. The children who were no longer going to be able to be held in detention, there was no other resource for those children. So there were no shelter cares or alternative counseling or other ways to redirect those children back into their families.
In a way, then, we kind of shoved some people off the cliff. Said, congratulations, you're free to fly.
Well, I participated in meetings in Portland in which people were just very concerned, because after the law change, what they said is that young women who had been prostituting in downtown Portland were taken out to the detention center, and then they had to be released. And when they released, their pimps were there waiting to take them back to the streets. And I think it caused law enforcement to feel like, even if they could take a child into custody, what use? You know, what use to get them off the street if they were simply released back into the circumstances that they took them out of? And there was a lot of consternation. We worked to try to put together some shelter contracts so that there would be some place for the kids who had no place to go. But to be very frank, it's minimal. It's a shelter system that was dependent on volunteers. It's never been adequately funded, and children don't have to go. If a youth is picked up, they have a choice, and you can't hold them involuntarily. So if they don't want to go, or their parents don't want them, or you can't reach them, and the youth doesn't want to participate, they're free to go. And that's really only been in the metropolitan area that we've been able to put that in place, just because of close proximity and able to move kids around who are picked up.
Let's pause for a moment, and I'll mention to our audience that you're with us on Capital Insight. I'm Representative Kevin Mannix from Salem. I'm your host for this program, and our guest for this program is Betty Uchytil, who has a very lengthy and impressive title, but who's basically high up in the hierarchy in state government, trying to help protect kids and work with families, and her agency now deals with the most difficult cases, as she mentioned in our earlier discussion. As we continue with this, I should mention too to the audience that if you ever have any questions, concerns, or any kind of criticism or comment, please contact me at Capital Insight, H395, State Capitol, Salem, Oregon, 97310. We're always happy to hear from you. Well, we've talked a little bit now about some of the issues confronting us, and I mean, I was only half kidding when I said, well, we've just shoved you off the cliff and you're free to fly. In other words, we said there's no more detention, but we also didn't come up with any funding for social programs or assistance programs as alternatives. And I recognize you've already discussed how you tried then to pitch in and do what you could to create some of this. Would it be fair to say that because of a combination of issues, that we might today be in a better position to try to address this in a positive way? When I say a combination of issues, homelessness is an issue. Kids at risk is an issue. Runaways per se and parental control is an issue. And when you put those together and then you talk about crime and the danger to these kids, the potential for them to be victimized, it would seem to me you could bring together a coalition of forces who would say, yes, we need to make a change. Yes, it'll be okay to detain the youngsters, provided you have a safe place to keep them, and provided we connect up with some programs that will help. And also provided that you quickly evaluate the situation so you're not just collaring a runaway 14-year-old and putting that person back into an abusive home that the person was running from. Has there been any discussion about this, or is this something that we need to start a discussion about now?
Well, I think there needs to be a discussion. There was one bill in the last session, and I believe it had one hearing.
Senator Dwyer and I think Representative Kitty Peirce, both from the Eugene-Springfield area, apparently were involved with that.
Right, and they were working with a group of concerned parents in the Eugene-Springfield area who had been really frustrated trying to get a handle on their teenagers' problems. There are some alternatives now. The State Office for Services and Families used to serve status offender youths in our foster care and with our in-home services, and we transferred with the last legislative session $12 million to the State Commission for Transfer to the local communities to serve those children. And so there are dollars for services. I think everybody agrees there aren't enough dollars, that amount of money won't serve all the children who need to be served, but there does need to be a discussion at the local level about how best to use that money, which youth you're going to serve, and how you're going to serve them.
Should we create some sort of a structure that, first of all, authorizes the detention under given circumstances, delineated circumstances, and at the same time, though, empowers the local community, say at the county level, to devise their own strategy for how then to deal with the family situation? Or do you think we need some standards, too, as to how they deal with it?
Well,
open-ended question.
Sure. My experience as a caseworker was that the detention part worked really well. The kids could be picked up, and they could be held for a few days at that point in time and while you tried to work something out. The problem was always what you did after you had the child. Often, the services that we had and that we know about now just really didn't work, because when you get an adolescent that's 14 or 15 years old and is confirmed in this kind of lifestyle, and the family issues, whatever they are, that brought them there, are all intact, there isn't a lot of commitment on the part of children and parents to change. There's a lot of commitment to want the other's behavior to change, but not to look at their own behavior. So I think this is a topic that's worthy of some real careful discussion and study about what would work once you do the detention. I do think there needs to be a local setting of priorities, and it certainly, there should be a discussion about standards, but I think even further, I don't think we know what works. I've been reading in the paper, and you probably have too, about the judge that chained the mother and child together. Well, that's pretty corny, but I think he's trying to do the right thing. He knows that those two people are the people that have to resolve the problem. I don't think chaining them together is going to work, but I don't think we have a real good handle on what is going to work. In the past, we placed children in foster care and treatment programs where they did not have to stay. Those who chose not to stay left, they ran away, and sometimes we got into placing kids 7, 8, 9 times in ever-increasing levels of intensity, and if they didn't want to make changes in their behavior, they didn't stay. Even when the treatment program was effective, when the child, or the foster home, when the child transitioned home, if the family also wasn't ready for the child and hadn't made some changes to accommodate the changes in the child, it was still not going to work. And that was the most frustrating part about dealing with these adolescents. The part that was the easiest and that worked the best was that if the law enforcement officer saw the child at the bus depot or out after curfew or in a place where they shouldn't be, or picked them up in a party, they could be detained. You did have them there. You could talk to them. For a few families, that was effective. They saw a serious problem. They went out and got counseling. They worked with their adolescent. But for many of these kids and families, we just didn't have the answer, and I'm not sure we have the answer yet.
Let's pause again for a moment, and I'll mention that you're with us on Capital Insight. I'm your host, Representative Kevin Mannix from Salem, and our guest today is Betty Uchytil. And Betty, in a moment I'm going to ask you to name the agency that you're with again. That's no longer Children's Services Division. I say that with a smile because it is a major change. But as to Capital Insight, if you ever have any questions or concerns or comments, feel free to write to me at Capital Insight, H395, State Capitol, Salem, Oregon, 97310. We're always happy to hear from you. Do tell me again the new name of the agency, because
The State Office for Services to Children and Families.
State Office for Services to Children and Families.
Right.
And you're also charged with working with the commissions on children and families at the local level?
Yes, we are. And we do have an intergovernmental agreement where some of the funds that were in the past spent or would have been spent by our agency are now transferred to the local level. Specifically, the Family Preservation and Support Funds, which are new dollars that the federal government provided starting in 1993. In 1995, those funds are being channeled through the local commissions. And the money that we were spending to serve status offenders in our caseloads, a significant portion of that has been transferred to the local commission so that they can do local plans for how these kids would be served in their communities.
Now let's mention something here. Status offender as opposed to delinquent. A status offender is someone who is in a difficult situation and needs services but has not necessarily committed a crime?
That's correct. This person would be within the jurisdiction of the court. In other words, the court could interfere with their life or direct their life solely because of their status, which is to be a juvenile if they do certain things, such as run away, be beyond parental control. And those things, the court could intervene in their life, could place them certain places, could provide them directions, just because of their status as a juvenile. That's why we use the jargon, status offender.
Now let's talk about these status offenders in terms of detention, because you've mentioned how in a few situations detention could work because the family's reunited with the child, the immediate problem is resolved, but that in most situations there are much larger issues that need to be resolved, and some people may be just trying to change behavior rather than changing other elements of their lives or controlling behavior. Is there any downside to detention as part of trying to explore these other alternatives? That is, assuming that detention means that we're talking about a protective custody kind of situation, not throwing somebody into a jail cell. But has there been any discussion of, well, gee, why is it a problem to allow the police officer to detain the runaway or to bring the runaway to a safe house and that kind of thing? Is there a downside to that?
Well, I think that the juvenile rights folks who attend to the legal protections for children would say that these youth do have a right to conduct their lives in the way they want to, and it's wrong for society to intervene. You were waiting for that one?
No, well, yes, in a way, because it sounds like we can have some fun with that. We've seen a lot of litigation about the rights of juveniles and the Supreme Court decisions and the right to wear black armbands to school to protest the Vietnam War, and the position of, well, you know, your rights don't end at the schoolhouse door, and apparently your rights also don't end just because you're a juvenile. Are we revisiting that discussion a little bit? Because it seems to me that the world experience now is that, well, 13-year-olds and 14-year-olds and 15-year-olds are not necessarily capable of running their own lives. In fact, if we thought they were, why don't we just emancipate everybody at the age of 12 and say, go forth and do your thing? I find it interesting that in the same dynamic these last few years we've changed the compulsory attendance laws to say you have to go to school till you're 18 or till you graduate from high school. It used to be 16, and I bet you years ago it was probably 14 or 12. Now, I'm not dragging you into the debate here because you may not want to be caught in this debate, but is this something that our politicians have grappled with? What is the balance of rights versus just exposing someone to danger and predatory activity? Have you seen any debate about this?
I haven't seen a great deal of debate about the juvenile status offender or runaway issue in recent years because we've been very focused on the issues of child abuse and the issues of juvenile crime. I don't know if I want to get into a debate with you, but I really think that the issue of rights needs to also be balanced against the issue of responsibility. And with right comes responsibility. And if folks don't exercise the responsibility, then perhaps they give up the right. And for me, that's how I would like to see this discussion.
That's interesting because you could talk about that in terms of the parents as well as the kids.
That's right, because kids don't end up in these situations usually without having something in their home situation that either gave permission for this kind of behavior or was so terrible that this behavior is a result of that. That's not always true. Sometimes kids who are on the street and really out of control do come from homes where you can't find those kind of problems. But as I said before, when I worked with these young people and their families, the parents were usually very interested in changing the child's behavior. The child was very interested in changing the parent's behavior. And what really needed to happen was that both of them needed to change their behavior some and acknowledge the responsibility and the rights of the other.
Well, then we have a dynamic here, too, where in our society we're always concerned about rights. You've brought in a very positive dynamic of, well, there's responsibilities, too, and that would tell me responsibilities of parents as well as of kids. I suppose, is it fair to say that maybe 50 or 75 years ago we only looked at it in terms of parental rights? And in fact, that's probably why we overlooked a lot of child physical abuse and sexual abuse, that wasn't our business, it's whatever happens in the family. Is it part of the dynamic of change now that we have to reevaluate all of this stuff and balance things out rather than go from one extreme to the other? That is absolute parental right, treat the child as property, absolute child right, leaving out responsibility here. Child can do what the child wants, no matter how dangerous it is, and try to come to a middle ground.
I think that's right. I think finding the balance is what we need to do, and there have been some things in our society that I believe have helped shift the balance. I think that the permission throughout our society and the media and others related to violence, sexual promiscuity, do everything you want to, has had a real impact on kids. And I think that the fact that most families have two working parents now, and there seems to be perhaps a greater focus on material things than on benefits to the family for parental involvement, is another shift. And when you combine those two, we have a group of adolescents who are given permission and in this highly stimulating environment, and parents who are really focused on something else. And I think that's how we're ending up with so many kids who are kind of disconnected.
If you were looking for a short-term solution and a long-term solution, would the long-term solution be to work more with parenting classes and to teach people how to be better parents and provide a support network, and the short-term solution to say, let's evaluate these dysfunctional families and provide some services to see what we can patch up, or am I missing something here?
I think for me the short-term solution would be to find a way to provide a service to a family and child who want it, because I think those are most likely to be successful. And if we're going to invest here, let's invest in the people who want things to be different, and then struggle a little bit more with the issue of rights and responsibilities for the folks who don't.
All right, so voluntary programs and availability with a support network for those who want it, and for the danger situations, and we may even say situations where parents themselves are out of control, abusive or whatever else, some opportunity for government to intervene without necessarily having to terminate parental rights or whatever else, but to straighten out the lives involved and see how far we can go with that in terms of something that's cost effective.
I agree. I think kids, particularly adolescents, don't have any idea the danger that they put themselves into in terms of the company that they keep, the other people who are out on the streets who are there perhaps to exploit them, the risks from disease. They just don't have any idea of it. I struggle with how over the long term to keep them out of that, because I think you could devise a strategy to pick them up and get them clean and talk to them and provide some counseling. But without something else, what I really struggle with is how do you keep them from going back to it? I just don't have an answer to that.
Well, Betty, we're going to have to struggle with that a little while longer, but I think that what you've shown us more than anything else is not a black and white situation where there's an overnight solution. And for all of us, it's time to think about how we might develop some ideas for solutions and work in our communities and with our political leadership to do that. I thank you for joining us on Capital Insight, and I thank our audience for joining us. See you next time.